Kill my hair back.
What is up, primates? Everybody watching, whether you be theist, atheist, religious, or secular. Today, I'm sorry, I'm like out of it right now. My name's Shane Isgrig, aka Shane the Skeptic. Welcome to the show. Today with me, I have Eddie Crume from Brute Facts Podcast. How are you doing today, Eddie?
Pretty good. How you doing, man?
Not bad at all. Why don't you give a quick rundown? Because I was watching some of your podcasts in the last few days, but why don't you tell my viewers a little bit about what you do on your channel and podcast?
Yeah, just kind of a quick backstory. I kind of grew up fundamentalist and being a science guy and, seeing all the false dichotomies between science, religion, this, that, and the other kind of sent me through a deconstruction phase and became agnostic for a little bit of time. And kind of started my journey into learning about other religions and landed in philosophy of religion. And
okay,
I ran into a lot of atheists who kind of went through the deconstruction that I, went through, and they, was a lot of hurt from, what the church had done, this, that, and the other. So I started to kind of build, wanted to build relationships and things of that nature. And I've kind of, developed quite a few atheist, agnostic, and theist friends. I'm kind of mere Christianity kind of guy, I don't care about all the dogmatism, the churches and stuff like that. So on my channel, I bring on atheists, and being in philosophy of religion, I've met a lot of bright minds. So I'll have, pretty significant philosophers on there time to time, atheist, agnostic, theist, and also, some of my atheist friends to kind of give the story, what happened with them, why they're, atheists and things of that nature. So
that's awesome. It sounds like we actually have a lot in common. And I think I should say that I feel like watching your channel, a little bit of your story, and kind of just listening to you talk, it helps me appreciate, even though you didn't deconvert from your religion, you deconverted from the fundamentalist aspect of it, and you don't look at it with I don't know, you don't adhere to dogma. And I think that since the dogmatic aspect of religion is the aspect that I think gives it most of the problems that it has, I think that seeing somebody leave that is in itself, anybody who wants to be an activist for secularism like myself, most of the problems that it is that they have with religion, you lose when you lose the fundamentalism. You lose when you stop adhering to dogma in that way. And I think that especially just listening to you talk about, finding these dichotomies between your religion and science, like, you're clearly not somebody who hasn't thought about this. You're not somebody who's just like unwilling to question your ideas. And I respect that a lot about you. And I think it's good that a lot of atheists need to be reminded that there are Christians like yourself, that not every Christian is some fundamentalist, young earth creationist. And I think that that's good. I think a lot of people like myself who acknowledge that would probably tell you that we feel like the people who are being less scientific and more fundamental are being more consistent with the holy books. But with that in mind, I think that there are a lot of, I've watched people spend a lot of time justifying why they think old earth creationism is consistent with the Bible and things of that nature. So like I said,
well, on that note, believe it or not, fundamentalists are an extreme minority in Christianity. when you take Christianity as a whole over history and throughout the world, they're a very, very small number. The thing is, they're the loudest. The type of evangelizing that they believe in is why you see them so often. So, like, for example, one of the main philosophy of religion group that I'm in, most Christians in there are like me. We don't evangelize, like those people do. We don't think that we're supposed to go out there and beat people over the head and tell people, you're not supposed to do this, that, or the other. And I would also push back on the fact that they're being more consistent. That's I would disagree with that wholeheartedly, because all they're doing is taking a very literalistic approach to an ancient document and an ancient ancient writings, which contain poetry, and it's a literature. It's a multiple amount of books with different rhetorical devices. And when people kind of approach that with a face value is how we end up with fundamentalism. And they also have a lot of presuppositions that's part of their paradigm, why they approach it that way, and pretty unjustified presuppositions also.
Okay, fair enough. I think that people like myself would probably respond, or I shouldn't even say it. I should just say that what I would give you in response to that is that I don't think there's any problem with looking at stories, whether they have some metaphorical value or some moral of the story that we learn from them. The story doesn't have to be true for there to be some moral value that we can learn from it. And I can appreciate stories that don't claim to be true, but have some point in them. So when people have the story about the boy who cried wolf, I don't think that it's based on a true story, but if I were to think that it was based on a true story and then find out, oh, there wasn't actually a boy who cried wolf and people believed him, and then one day he did it, they didn't believe him and he got eaten. If I found out that wasn't true, that wouldn't make me no longer believe in the lesson of the story. I would still go, okay, but there's still a point here, right? So I have no problem with people getting morals from stories that aren't true. However, I think when the story, when there are aspects of the story that aren't true and people believe them to be true, I think that that's where some of the problems come in. And without diving in too much on the subject of fundamentalism, I did want to bring it up because I did want to bring up the distinction between Christians like yourself who aren't fundamentalists. Let me ask you, what, according to you, is a fundamentalist? How would you define fundamentalist Christianity?
I would break them down into basically their epistemological approach to scripture. And it's actually, so if you were to take the evangelical churches that are in the United States, that would include a lot of Lutheran churches, I think most or all, if not all, Methodist churches, Presbyterians, and then you have your Southern Baptist, your Pentecostal, your Assemblies of God, the Charismatic, and non-denominationals. Well, Methodists and Presbyterians and Lutherans, most Lutherans, all of these different churches actually allow for evolution. They allow for all these different things. So the fundamentalist part would be those churches that are considered ultra conservative, the ones that hold to a literal principle of scripture. None of those hold to a literal principle of scripture. Those who have this dogmatic inerrancy of scripture, which would be part of the unjustified paradigm I was talking about, that because it says that it is God breathed, that somehow they leap in logic from that to every word has to be true. So it would be more of not all of your Baptist churches, but your Southern Baptist, your Pentecostal, your Charismatics, non-denominationals. Most of those churches are the ones that are considered fundamentalists. And it's actually, as you and I use the word to identify a certain ultra conservative, it was actually something that was used by them as virtue, as in they hold to the fundamentals, but it's really not it's when we look at fundamentalism in general across all religions, you'll see that those ultra conservative, hard nosed people that call themselves fundamentalists, a lot of times are the ones, whether intentionally or not, are the ones that are causing most of the issues in society.
Yeah, no disagreement with that aspect of it. So, okay, I do like your position, and I'm glad that you were able to give that today. So today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about moral philosophy, particularly moral realism and anti-realism. And I made a chart, not for this conversation specifically, but just for in general. Let me see if I can get the whole thing on screen. I'm an amateur at StreamYard, so everyone, please forgive me. I'm trying to make my screen bigger. God damn it. I don't know how.
Hey, there you go. Put the spotlight on me.
Even, okay, hold on. Now I did it. There we go. All right. So you will see here we have realism and anti-realism. These are the main umbrellas of moral philosophy. Let me try to center that better. Damn. Anyway, so I would fall under subjectivism, right? And I think that when I explain myself as a subjectivist, most people understand me to be either an error theorist or a non-cognitivist, or a relativist. So I think I'm hoping to kind of make a distinction on what my point is today. So for well, I guess let's start with your understanding. What is your understanding of moral realism as opposed to moral anti-realism?
Moral realism would be that there are facts about morality, as in, to say something is wrong is a true or false statement. It has a truth value to it. It has, it can be true or it can be false. There are things that are really, truly wrong, which usually people will, speak of some type of objective morality that it's based upon.
Okay, I agree with your definition and your understanding of moral realism. So that's good. Moral anti-realism, for me, is not necessarily this assertion that moral facts are false, but rather that they aren't true in and of themselves. Yeah. So to kind of help put this in perspective, are you familiar with the observation about is and ought statements by David Hume?
Yes.
And
how you bridge the from the is to the ought, right?
Right. So we agree with Hume on this, that it's logically wrong to get an ought from an is or vice versa, right?
Yeah. There's not, it's a leap to get from something that's descriptive to an ought. So we describe something like in science, and how do we get from this is the way it is to we ought to do it this way? Yeah. So what they call the is ought problem. So
fully agree with that understanding of it. So for me, I haven't seen theists or atheists, both have claimed to demonstrate that they have some way of showing there to be objective morality. And when I think about morality pertains to what's right and wrong in regards to what we ought to do or ought not do. Like this is what morality is based on, right? I don't see why people think they are arriving at some objective sort of ought statement. I think we have to begin, like with anything, we have to begin with some number of assumptions. In this conversation, you and I assume that reality is real, logic and reason work, and that words have some kind of meaning, not intrinsic, but at least the way that we use them, right? I feel like for morality, we have to assume that we ought to survive and that we ought to promote survival and flourishing in others. Now, a lot of people think that this is a problem, but I don't think that it is, because we do operate with those assumptions. We do assume that we ought to survive, and that is just an axiomatic fact. Like, we feel as though we ought to survive, right? And I think that morality is based on that subjective ought assumption. And I feel like, yes, once you begin with, like, if you and I are in my apartment and the apartment is on fire, and it is the case that getting out of the apartment saves our lives, I mean, as far as descriptive statements go, that's it. We are in an apartment. We will survive if we leave the apartment. If we inject our assumption that we ought to do that which promotes our survival, then it is objectively true that getting out of the apartment is the right thing to do. Like, there is an objectively right way to survive, but I don't see it being demonstrated, or like facts of the universe that say like we ought to survive. So do you see where I'm coming from in respect to that?
Yeah, and I think a very important distinction needs to be made between moral ontology and moral epistemology, because
Yes.
more with the moral epistemology, it's going to be the things that we know about morality, what we should
Right.
do, these kind of things. And the ontology would be the study of kind of why we have
Yes.
moral facts
What
or
it is.
moral things, right? So
Right.
that's a very important distinction. And also there's another one, and that is the psychological aspect of it, the subjective experience. So
Right.
a moral realist wouldn't disagree that there's a subjective nature to it, as our
Right.
psychological disposition.
Okay.
And we would actually agree that it is intuitional to escape the fire, and that in that position to preserve
Right.
life, most ought. And that is actually what I would use to demonstrate that there is an objective morality, and that is that we have the intuition that we
So
should
this
do these things.
Okay, so here's my problem with that, is that for something to be objective, it needs to be true, independent of human minds causing or interpreting it. And your basis is an intuition, which is dependent on minds causing it. So I agree with you that it's intuitive that we ought to survive, and that it's intuitive that if the apartment's on fire, that we ought to get out. And of course, you and I aren't going to sit there and deductive reason it out. But I think that we would be operating off of that intuition. Yeah, we'd be operating in accordance with that intuition, which is fine. It's just that it's an intuition, and by definition, subjective, right?
Right. Well, I wouldn't completely disagree with the definition of objective either. Objective would be it's something that is true regardless of what your opinion is on it. So as far as all humans' minds, that's not the way I've seen it defined in metaethical philosophy. So I would say that objective just means that there is a standard that transcends your subjective experience. So all of us would have, all of us, just speaking in generality, would have the intuition to escape the fire, to preserve our life. Or a better example would be that there's a child in there and you have the ability and means to save the child. We all have the intuition that we ought to save the child. So that would be all that's as far as I would go with being objective.
Right. So I think that when you talk about subjective, I think, and this is maybe one of the most common problems that comes up in my conversations about objective and subjective, is I think that you're conflating moral subjectivism with moral relativism. And that's like totally understandable, but if you don't know the difference, but do you?
Yeah, no. It actually, it's an individual relativism. Moral relativism is society kind of agrees on what's right or wrong, but subjectivism is it's an individual relativism. Relativism.
I did put cultural relativism under relativism because cultural relativism would be a form of relativism. The problem I have with relativism is, since it falls under realism, let's use cultural relativism as an example. Is if someone were to say that it is, wrong to commit a Holocaust in like Western American society, but it was right for the Nazis, then what you would have would be two contradictory statements that you're saying are both true, and that violates the law of non-contradiction. So relativism is thrown out of the gate for me. Like, right, just like that, two things that contradict each other cannot actually both be true. Just violates one of our logical absolutes, right?
But I would ask, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, actually, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, but on subjectivism, how are you in any better position, because there aren't any moral facts. There aren't. I mean, it's not a fact that it's wrong, other than your opinion, your subjective experience of what you think is right or wrong.
It's wrong because it is wrong for, like, my reasons for murder being wrong are reasons that you have as well, whether you realize it or not. So you value your own well-being, and you're not a dishonest interlocutor, so I don't think we have to go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, no.
But you value your own well-being, and so do I. So you and I value health, we value flourishing. And I really think that morality can be deduced to this. We like promotion of health and flourishing. And I use the word pleasure a lot, and I think it's the best word like in my understanding, but a lot of people misunderstand me when I use the word pleasure, and they're thinking of pleasure in the sense of, like, the pleasure you get,
a hedonistic kind of pleasure. Yeah.
Right. I just mean pleasure in the sense of, any sort of pleasure. Like, I feel like you derive pleasure from health, you derive pleasure from existence, you derive pleasure from flourishing. So I think that if someone were to go, well, why should I care if you say that's wrong, if you're saying that you are basing it being wrong off of an assumption? I would respond to that by going, it's an assumption that you have as well, and they're values that you have as well. But the thing is, I think works.
But the thing is, the argument you're making now is the same argument that naturalist moral realists use. That is the ontology of why they think that you've got non-naturalist and then naturalist moral realist, and the naturalist moral realist would actually agree completely with you that we all want to flourish and not be harmed or not have suffering, and so we should do what promotes flourishing for humanity, right, and things of that nature. So how would you distinguish what you mean by subjectivism from that? Because they would actually agree with you.
So that's not realism, because realism would be this idea that moral statements can be facts objectively in and of themselves. So it's almost like if you were to punch me in the face and someone pointed at you and said, incorrect. When you say right or wrong pertains to morality, right or wrong pertains to correct or incorrect. And I feel like my concept of morality makes sense of this, because we all assume that we ought to promote flourishing. So if you punch me in the face and somebody says, that's wrong, what they really mean is that's the wrong way to promote flourishing for human beings. What you did is wrong in relation to this goal that we have.
That is exactly the argument they make, though, for a naturalist moral realist. So when you say it's
not actually...
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry, but I think that we would disagree on an understanding of natural moral realism, because moral realism is the idea that moral statements are true or false in and of themselves.
Which is what you're saying. You're saying that it's no. Wait a minute. What do you mean by in and of itself? Hold on. Clarify that part.
I don't think it's an objective fact about the universe. Like, it is no descriptive fact of the universe that says Eddie ought not punch Shane in the face. Like, it's not. Now, if we inject our assumption that we ought to promote flourishing, then according to that goal, there's a right and wrong way to achieve that goal. Punching me in the face is the wrong way to promote my flourishing, and that's why you would be wrong to do it.
I'm still having
my problem is this, and here's why I think it's not moral realism, and I think maybe this would help you understand where I'm coming from, is why ought we promote flourishing? Like, I know it seems intuitive, but it being intuitive doesn't mean it's an objective fact. Like, why ought we do that which is good? Why ought we survive? Why ought we promote flourishing? I'm fine with assuming these things. It's just, if we question them, I don't see an answer ever actually being demonstrated to me. Like,
Yeah, so I mean, I understand that. So, but what I would say was, um, if it's intuitional, then you would need a strong argument against that intuition. So, why would someone who thinks that it is truly wrong to do bad things to people, why would they want to embrace some type of anti-realism if the intuition is that some form of moral realism is true? I mean, I would have to say, like, let's take A theory and B theory, right?
Well,
Of
it comes
time.
to the burden of proof on that. Like, if somebody is claiming that morality exists ontologically, and I'm sitting here as the skeptic going, okay, show me the morality. It's not a matter of like, you show me that there isn't any ontologically existing objective morality. It's really more like, I'm sitting here as the skeptic going, where's the ontologically existing morality? Because I understand morality, like I mean, people that I know, whether they be Christian or atheist, they seem to view me as a moral person. Our understanding of morality seems to be similar enough. I think that it can really just be deduced down to the assumption that we ought to survive and promote the survival and flourishing and health of others.
Right. And I wouldn't disagree with that. And that's what I'm
So,
saying. So if it seems okay, so if I asked you, and for anybody that's listening, I want to caveat this. In philosophy, we do thought experiments, and they are sometimes extremes. They're reductio, to draw out the reasoning and things. So if please don't be offended by any of the thought experiments that we use, because this is how we draw it out. This is actually common practice, and we're not being flippant about it and things of that nature. So
right.
Let's say, if I was to ask you if slavery was wrong, you would respond no, because it doesn't promote flourishing, right?
I
Or
would say that it is
somebody
wrong because it doesn't promote flourishing.
Okay.
And causes unnecessary suffering.
So what about their subjective understanding of the world? Why would your experience, your subjective experience, and what you think is wrong, what would trump their subject if they thought it was right? And they thought that we could, let's, for example, say we could double human flourishing, by having certain people as, servants to others. What makes it wrong or right if we have two clashing or competing subjective, positions on it?
Sure. So there are two approaches that I have to this. And the first one that I have would be that a common criticism that I seem to get from my view of morality is that if something was doing something immoral and I were to like approach them and try to philosophically talk them out of it, that I wouldn't be able to do so. And this is something that applies to all of them. Like, you couldn't go up to somebody doing something wrong and just go, hey, God doesn't like that. Like, clearly that's not just going to stop a murderer from murdering somebody. Just like I can't stop somebody from doing certain moral things, or in some cases we can. But respond to it by saying that somebody would ask me, well, like, why should I care if you think it's wrong? I would say that I'm calling it wrong for reasons that you agree with. Like, you agree with me that we ought to promote flourishing, right? And that person, like, if I actually like apply epistemology and just like really break them down to it, I could probably get them to realize that promoting the flourishing of other human beings actually increases their own flourishing. And I think that this is a fact about us as a social species. And if somebody doesn't acknowledge it, then perhaps it needs to be educated to them. But nonetheless, I would say that somebody could ask me like, okay, you are saying it's wrong, but it's wrong according to a value. Why should I care what's wrong if it's wrong according to your value? My response is that if it's a value that you also share, I'm basically telling you something that is right or wrong about achieving a goal that we share. So it's kind of like if you were to go on the highway and I were to go, hey, if you knew what I knew, you wouldn't be doing this, right? So if somebody somebody owns slaves and they go, okay, well, for me, I think this promotes the most human flourishing. And I say, you're wrong. What I'm telling them is, we're in respect to the goal of promoting the most human flourishing for our country. If you knew what I knew, you would not do that. So it's similar to like if you were gonna get on the highway and you had this goal of getting to work as fast as you could. If I told you, I think you should take the side road, it'll be faster. You're wrong going on the highway. It's not the fastest way. What I'm telling you is like, if you knew this thing that I knew, you would not be doing that, because you would realize it would be the wrong way to achieve the goal that we both have. So I think promoting flourishing is a goal that we both have. So there isn't any problem with it.
Two things to that. One, it seems like you're just, first of all, I mean, my questions are genuine. I'm not trying to trap you or anything like that, because I'm kind of intrigued by the, a theist doesn't have to be a moral realist, and
Correct.
I'm the kind of person that, that if one side makes more sense or convincing, then that's where it doesn't matter to me.
Right.
I'm trying to understand it, because I've I've only talked to a few people that hold to moral subjectivism or anti-realism, and it's a few of them's been error theorists, and I just that's a lot of talking. But anyway,
I feel like those people make it harder for me, because every time somebody talks to a subjectivist, they're getting their view, and I'm like, stop it, you're ruining this for us.
You're not saying that there aren't moral facts. You're just saying that, because an error theorist would say it's just there are no moral facts. It's just not true, false, or anything. Or actually, it's an error to try to look at morality as
right. Well, I think my criticism of error theorists is it's as though they are asserting moral facts are wrong, which is still calling them objectively wrong. And I think it makes, like, it has the same flaws that saying that it something could be objectively right is. It's like, what? No, but for me as a moral anti-realist, I'm not saying that things can't be right or wrong. I'm just saying that, like,
it's not.
Punching me in the face is wrong, but we need a subjective assumption or axiom.
It's not a fact.
Right. Well, it's a fact once we inject that, though. Right. Once we. And I think one of the best comparisons for morality is, and I've seen Aristotle do this a lot, is if you compare morality to medicine, medicine has this goal of promoting health for as many people as possible, right? Well, because of the fact that the goal is to cure you of disease, homeopathy is objectively the wrong way to achieve that goal. So I can't just say it in and of itself, well, homeopathy is wrong. Like, homeopathy is incorrect. But if I say homeopathy is the incorrect way to cure your disease, now it makes sense. Once we inject our subjective starting point, we arrive at the end. So I think that unless you have a subjective starting point, you never arrive at any moral statements. You simply cannot make conclusions about properties that didn't in any way appear in the axioms or the premises from which they derived.
Well, my issue with that would be, I don't see where the disagreement is, because you always start with the subjective experience.
But what I'm saying is start with the assumption. Like, math we experience subjectively, but I wouldn't call math subjective, because what we are experiencing is objective. But what in the case of morality, the variables of it are dependent on subjectivity. And when the variables themselves are dependent on subjectivity, like if the first thing you have to do is start with a subjective ought, I don't see how it could be objective.
So the issue I see here is when you're talking about the subjective nature, starting with the assumption of subjectivity, and then you're saying that, once we look at, we should promote it, human flourishing or something. It seems like you're adding an objective standard, though.
It's not objective. It's because I can't prove that I ought to survive. Like, yeah, it's intuitive to me, but like, how could I demonstrate that it's true that I ought to survive?
But why
like the same way 2 + 2 = 4 is true. Shane ought to survive. Like, how do we demonstrate these as being equally ontological, like equally true?
But a moral realist, they don't have to demonstrate anything. You know,
I think they do.
No. If you look at G.E. Moore, I mean, it's irreducible. It's normative. We don't have to. There are several different avenues of moral realism, and if it's intuitive and it's normative, it's not reducible. Then there's not, just like, for example, let's say, you know, the colors black and white. I know the difference between black and white, but I can't demonstrate or tell you what the difference is. So we can have an intuition.
Well, in the sense you can, I think.
No, I can't.
You can demonstrate whiteness and blackness, like showing me a white thing and a black thing, and like asking me to observe some difference between them until we arrive at the point of like what that difference is.
I don't think
you'd be able to
demonstrate what I was. No, I don't think you understand what I was saying. Yeah. No, what I was saying was I can look at black and white and say there's a difference between I can see that there's a difference between the two, but I can't explain how we get, you know, it's just, I don't know how we get black or white. So that's the same thing with intuition and morality. We know when things are wrong and when things are right, but it's irreducible. There's not a definition there. It's not definable.
Right. So I feel like I'm having this experience of like listening to and talking to moral realists about why they think morality is objective. And let's remember the definitions here. Objective is true and existing, independent of minds causing or interpreting it. Subjective is dependent on minds causing or interpreting it. And I go, why do you think morality is objective? They always say, because it's just so intuitive.
No.
And like that intuitive is like, they always go back to their intuition. It always seems to be their starting point. And I don't have a problem with an intuition being the starting point. My problem is just that like it's subjective and that's fine.
Well, I wouldn't agree with that definition of morality of objective either. Objective just means that it's not it's right or wrong whether you agree with it or not. It's not up to your opinion of it. So it's wrong to torture people for the fun of it. You know, that's an objective standard. We shouldn't torture people for the fun of it. And the reason it's objective is because even though somebody might think that it's okay, it's not. It's really not okay. That's all that objective means when we're talking
like you
about.
So like you said earlier, some of the questions that come up in moral philosophies and ideas, they can come off out of context to be bad. But like, let me ask you, why is it wrong to torture someone? Like, obviously we agree, but like, let me actually ask you, why is it wrong to torture someone?
Well, that's just what irreducible and normative is. We just have
but like, what are some properties that exist within torture that make torture a bad thing? Like, what bad properties?
Well, I mean, I can give you reasons why I think that we shouldn't, but that's not why it's intuitional. You know, it's
no, but I'm asking, like, so you have a situation where somebody is torturing someone, right? What about it makes that bad? Like, what involved? Because if we had the same equation, but he was just giving him a handshake, then obviously nothing bad's happening.
Oh yeah.
But why is torturing him, like, what makes it a bad thing?
Well, I could give you, you know, the meta theistic reason, but on the surface of it, it would be because your evil intentionality and what you're doing you're hurting the person.
Right.
You're
hurting the person. Right. You're causing suffering,
right? Which
is dependent on minds causing it. Like every immoral act that I'm ever presented with is always causing suffering, and suffering is dependent on minds. Right?
But how I don't see how that follows with the moral realism and the subjective realism.
Because if objective, and I guess part of it is we're not sharing the exact same understanding of objective, but if something's objective, it exists independent of minds causing or interpreting it. And when we say that what makes something wrong is it causes suffering, and suffering is dependent on minds causing or interpreting it, then I think that we're using a subjective reason to justify calling it wrong.
Where are you getting
And
the minds interpreting it? Because I've never heard that in philosophy.
I would rather use caused than interpret. I try to throw both words in there, but I've looked up the definitions of objective and subjective time and time again from like Webster, Oxford. These are my definitions that I find consistent with those definitions. But like look up the first definition you want to right now.
Well,
And,
hold on, wait a minute. But you shouldn't go to those places to look it up, because this is an area of meta ethics. You should go to Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy or something like that, because in the ethical literature, the way that you're using objective is not how it's used in meta ethics. So when we're talking about, for example,
well, it's how it's used in all of philosophy. And it seems like once we enter the branch of philosophy that is metaethics, we make this exception for the definition of the word. Like, I feel like once we enter metaethics, we just start defining objective almost completely differently.
Yeah, but the thing is, I mean, that's like going into, a scientific area, a specific scientific area, and bringing your own definitions. You can't do that. You have to look at those that are interacting with it and how they understand the words, because definitions are according to their usage.
Right. I'm not redefining the word. That's what I'm saying is,
well, but
my definition,
right? But you're using a definition that's not used in the literature for metaethics. So it's
sort of my problem though, is because it is how the definitions are used in the rest of philosophy. And if philosophically speaking, objective truths are truths that exist independent of minds causing or interpreting them,
I wouldn't agree that the rest of philosophy it's like that either. Because when we're looking at objective and subjective, objective would simply just mean that it would be that it's not subjective, and subjective would be the personal experience of the person. So
I don't know.
So I think that's where you and I are probably having a disconnect, is because my experience with metaethics and stuff is actually with the metaethical philosophers themselves. So when I'm using these information, and I probably should have in the beginning, kind of more explained, my understanding of it based on the background. But when we talk about, independent of being interpreted or caused or practiced by a mind or someone with the mind, that's just not anything that I wouldn't agree with. If that's what moral realism entails, I wouldn't agree with that either. So
I think that is the meat of the conversation, and I think that's the conclusion that I'm most happy with. So I want to figure out, like, if you agreed with my definitions of objective and subjective, and as I explained moral subjectivism, that there are objectively right and wrong ways to promote flourishing. It's just that we subjectively assume that we do. Do you think that I'm being at least deductive in my reasoning, and that so far that's valid? It's just the definition that we disagree on?
But I think the definition affects everything, because
it does.
Yeah, moral realism is built on the idea that there are moral facts, but it doesn't remove the subjective nature of it. So, I mean, if we were going to like find common ground, I mean, I would just say we have intuitions of what's right and wrong, but yes, it is a subjective practice of how we do, what's right and wrong. We evaluate things. We have instincts. If we see a child that's drowning and we have the ability to save the child, then we more than likely, most people with the normal working mind are going to go in and save the child, and most people would agree that we ought to do that. But yes, right. There is a subjective nature to it.
But you would agree that morality is dependent on the assumption that we ought to survive and that we ought to promote flourishing?
I wouldn't say it's dependent on that, but I wouldn't disagree that is part of moral things. Because see, when you start talking about being dependent, you're talking about the ontology of it. And given that as an ontology would be the same issue I have with moral realism, natural moral realism, is the terms are, just for my comfort, are a bit, ambiguous, as far as what flourishing is. Because if I ask 20 different people, I'm probably going to get 20 different answers of what human flourishing is,
Right.
and then I think we're going to run. Go ahead.
Well, I think there's some areas of morality where some definitions having very vague meaning actually helps them out. So like the fact that you and I can't necessarily define good or bad, but that there is some vague understanding of these words, it helps us at least convey, like, you and I could disagree on whether or not something's good, but the fact that we're able to kind of demonstrates that we are able to share some understanding of this good. And I think that good is like, they're just labels that we use. I think that good is a label that we use for things like flourishing, accuracy, health, and bad is what we use for experiences like suffering. And if someone were to go, well, like, why is suffering bad? Well, we experience that way. Like if you were on fire, you wouldn't go, oh man, I can't philosophically justify calling this bad. Like it's my experience. It's the axiomatic experience of it. So, okay.
So let's dig a little deeper into that part of it. Given that, why is this is just kind of playing devil's advocate on it. It's why would flourishing be a good thing? Why would I
think
suffering be a bad thing?
Right. And it's kind of like what I just said, where it's like we just experience it that way. It's just an axiomatic fact that we experience suffering is bad and flourishing is good. Okay. And that's kind of it. Now, it's an axiomatic fact that we experience them that way, but I don't see it as being an axiomatic fact that we ought to promote flourishing or we ought not suffering, or that suffering is bad. I think it's self-evidently true that we experience suffering is bad, but like to prove that suffering is bad, like just it, like I don't see how you could demonstrate suffering is bad this like in a way that's to be true in a way that's similar to like 2 + 2 = 4 is true. Like these are different levels of truth. And I don't think that like, Eddie ought not punch Shane is true the same way 2 + 2 = 4 is true. Like, yeah. I just don't.
Well, it's, the statement that doing harm to someone or something wrong is just as, the person is just as wrong as the person who says 2 + 2 = 5. That's actually just a philosopher that's been quoted saying that. So I don't necessarily think that they're equatable like that. Okay. I would say that it is true that some things are in fact wrong. And it is true that some things are, in fact, good. And giving the truth, that's how, I can look back and say that what the Nazis did is absolutely, in fact, wrong. I can say the same thing about slavery, this, that, and the other. Now, while flourishing in my own personal subjective experience obviously plays into my intuitions on that, I don't think they explain it well enough. Okay. So what I mean is, to say that flourishing, or as I don't know if you're familiar with the exchange between Sam Harris and
Jordan Peterson.
Yeah,
I've watched it like 5 times.
Yeah. I love it. It's great. I mean, both of them. I like. It's a fan.
They're both really smart guys. Yeah.
Yes. So I would, and Jordan Peterson's not necessarily, he's not really a theist. He just kind of lives.
He's not. Yeah.
Yeah.
He's sort of like, Brett Weinstein explained metaphorical truths. Like the best example I could think of is if you're at a gun range, a metaphorical truth is that the gun is always loaded. We're not saying it's a fact that the gun's always loaded. It's just acting in accordance as though that was true. promotes the best outcome, so we do it.
Right.
And Jordan Peterson clearly seems to view Christianity that way, and it's taken him a long time to get anywhere near admitting it. But he clearly doesn't actually believe in it. He just sees a benefit from the belief.
Yeah, it has a pragmatic effect. It works. He thinks that's the best way of flourishing. So when I approach ethics, like I said, I don't necessarily have to be a moral realist, even being a theist, and also understand what kind of theist that I am. My epistemology is probabilistic of nature. And I think that our confidence should be, in direct relation with the evidence that we find is convincing. So I won't say that there's not, I will say that I don't think there's any certainty. We can have high degrees of confidence, I am, to me, it is far more plausible that there is some intelligent something behind reality. And the reason that I'm a Christian is because given, if we take our presuppositions and set them aside and look at all the facts objectively and say, hey, if there was a God and these things, then these miracles could happen, given the explanatory scope of all the facts that we have around it. To me, it just seems more plausible that that's probably what happened. So while I'm not certain that Christianity is true, I think, given my experience in the world and what I've learned and with given the fact that to me it's more plausible there is a higher something, it seems that Christianity fits that more. So given that, that's also how I approach ethics. To me, I don't disagree with what you're saying, but the fact that we would, ground it in flourishing or something like that, to me, it's not a good enough stand. It's hard for me to say that somebody should go to jail because they caused harm to somebody else when that's just my subjective, experience in life.
Well, but if it's everyone's subjective experience that suffering is bad, and everybody subjectively agrees that they ought to minimize suffering, then the correct way to minimize that goal would be to throw people who cause suffering in jail. I don't see why it's such a problem to go like, okay, but I just have a problem with it because suffering's bad to me. But but you want to live in a world with less suffering, and so do the other citizens who live in the society that you live in. So we can still justify jailing people. Yeah,
but you just created an objective standard.
I don't think we did. I think that we started with the subjective.
Because that's the argument I would make.
But consensus doesn't bring us to truth. Like, everyone in the world could agree that blue is the best color. That wouldn't make it a fact that blue is the best color. Right? No, so why are you saying that like everyone agreeing that murder is bad would have anything to do with like
it's intuitional,
whether or not it is?
No, what I'm saying is it's intuitional to all of us, and that would be what objectivity is. That's what we're talking about. Because it wouldn't be, because if you disagreed with everybody else, is it right or wrong to put them in jail if it's everybody else's intuition that they should be in jail for what they did?
Well, there's going to be disagreement whether you think it's objective or not, but I think that what we do is we figure out our disagreement, and we can do this with anything else. So what I'm setting, if you have flourishing as the standard for morality, then sure, the standard itself, like it's rooted, the groundwork is subjective. But then if I argue with somebody about something like gay marriage, and I go, well, why do you think gay marriage is wrong? And they think, well, I think that it decreases overall flourishing in human society. Well, I will tell them that logically speaking, if that was true, I would agree with them. So now we go, okay, well, we ought to do that which minimizes suffering, and we ought to do that which promotes the most flourishing. In respect to that goal, one of us is right in regards to legalizing gay marriage. One of us is right and one of us is wrong about what promotes more flourishing. So if we could agree on that goal, then we could start arguing about who's right or wrong. And there's some objective criteria to differentiate on who's more aligned with that subjective starting point that we share. So I think subjective can still be universal, might be a good way to sum up what I'm saying.
but you just created moral facts by saying that someone is right and wrong in that moral situation.
I would
So-
disagree with that because it's a fact, but only in relation to an assumption that we can't prove to be true. So based on a subjective assumption, there are facts about it. Like,
but being a moral realist, and a non-reductionist, I would say that it is a fact that certain things are wrong, even though I can't demonstrate why they're wrong. So that's what I'm saying. I don't think you're far off from where I'm at.
right. I think we're just, I think the crux of our disagreement on my like moral framework is whether what I'm proposing is more aligned with realism or anti-realism.
Yeah.
It seems, because I'm saying that with an assumption, then there are facts about it. And it seems like in your mind, therefore, I'm saying there are moral facts. But what I'm saying is there can be moral facts, but only if we start with subjective assumptions. And if we require subjectivity for something, we can't call it objective anymore.
So I'm gonna try to steel man where we're at, your position.
Okay.
So I think I know where I wasn't totally understanding. So as I'm sitting here, my ethical framework is there is this objective standard out here, even though I haven't had subjective experience, this, that, or the other. And you're saying we got to start with the subjective, and then we can reason our way into, what is right or what is wrong or things of that nature. So
adequate steel man there. That is exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying we have a subjective starting point and there are objective facts, rights and wrong about it.
Yeah. So I actually wouldn't disagree with your position there, because you have to start with the subjective nature. I don't think that this objectivity is some type of platonic form, like.
So it almost sounds like we have almost the same ethical framework and then just a different conclusion.
Yeah, I think we're similar. Now, I would
similar, not exactly the same, but I guess
I would say that there is an objective standard outside of us, but that that on my worldview and my metaethical view, that objective standard would be what is eminence from participating in the reality of an intelligent being. That would be the ontology of how it can exist. Without that, I'm with you. There's no way to say. I would agree with you in arguing against natural moral realist that there is no way to have an objective standard outside of there being some type of something apart from human subjectivity. So you and I would actually be in agreement against natural moral realists, because I don't think if I wasn't a theist, I would probably still try to hold to some type of moral realism, because it just seems that it's true or false, or that certain things are wrong. But I would be some type of moral Platonist, like there's some Platonic realm or something like that, which, someone can take that position as a naturalist. But most of them ground their ontology in, suffering or flourishing or this, that, or the other. And I would actually agree with you that without, something providing the objectivity of it, you can't have that objectivity.
Okay. Well, that is I think
I'm super stoked with you and Tom now, because this is going to be fun.
Yeah. No, I honestly, my debate with T-Jump is like, I think no matter what happens in that debate, a lot of people are going to learn a lot from it, and it'll be a very fruitful discussion for moral philosophers, whichever side they be on in that debate. But okay, there was a question that I had a while ago, and I didn't want to interrupt because you had a lot of shit to say. No, I'm glad I didn't interrupt, because you said a lot of good shit that I'm glad I got on my podcast.
Yeah.
But earlier you asked me, like, kind of, if I were to call something wrong, it was something to the effect of like why that should matter to somebody else, right? Yeah. And I guess I kind of want to pose that same question back to you: is if you tell me something's wrong, and I ask like, you know, why I should care, what would you respond to me with in respect to that?
Well, I tend not to inject, you know, theistic answers to a lot of, you know, moral questions or things of this nature. If somebody wants to have that discussion, then, you know, I'm totally cool with it. But, you know, the way that I approach everything, I try to do it on the level of, you know, with who I'm talking to or things of that nature, so I can find some common ground. So to answer that, it would actually be, you know, a two different way question. So if I'm talking to you and I know that you're, you know, agnostic, atheist, or whatever, then I'm going to, you know, kind of relate with you and say that it's wrong because someone has this subjective experience of pain.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, and
because I've had Christians, like there was this guy I used to work with who he would tell me like not to do something, and it was like something I'm not harming anyone anyway. I'm like, why? You go, it's a sin. I'd go, okay. You realize that telling an atheist that's a sin is like telling someone in America that's illegal in France.
Yeah.
Like, okay, well, if I was in France, that might be relevant.
Yeah, that's absolutely.
So I think
it's a very fair and valid point, and that's the issue. What I was going to say earlier was, you know, the Christians like me, we don't evangelize like the other people. We don't go out and tell people, you know, hey, what you're doing is wrong, this, that, or the other. Like they feel the need to. So that's why you don't hear from a lot of Christians like us. I made an effort to be public because I have no desire to evangelize people. I mean, if you, in your rational thought, if you come to the realization or understanding or belief that there's something higher, fantastic. You know, that's great. I will be happy about that, but that's not my goal. My goal is I'm not an apologist. I'm in philosophy of religion. So I'm just like everybody else and trying to find what's true about reality and life. And I want to help people. I'm more into, you know, formal logic and things of that nature. I love argumentation, structure, you know, fallacies, all these different things, because I think that if everyone, regardless of what their belief, lack belief, or whatever it is, could reason more properly, then it will be a better world altogether.
Yeah.
And at the same time, if I can let them know, hey, you know, I'm a Christian, I'm a theist, and, you know, I want to just be your friend. You know, I want to love you. I want to care about you. I don't want to be out there telling people. And those very same fundamentalists, if they actually read the Bible where Paul says, let God judge those outside the church and we judge those inside the church, they would realize that they're not even supposed to be doing what they're doing. And because
you hear the fundamentalists, listen to the man.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well,
seriously.
So I don't know if you're familiar, but I came on to the YouTube and podcasting and all this from the Atheist Roundtable.
That's where I heard of you for sure.
Yeah, Oz and Pasta Mike. Pasta Mike and Oz are like, you know, I mean, they're like brothers to me. They have done so much stuff for me, even though they're, you know, atheists and I'm a theist, because we have actually a common goal, and that's to you know, build those relationships and try to help a lot of those new atheists who are coming out of this, you know, toxic environments and things. So on TikTok, that's how I met them. I didn't even get on TikTok to talk religion, you know, because I'm in a philosophy group on Facebook that's where I, you know, and I saw all this bullying by Christians and new atheists, and mostly the Christians. So I just started calling them out, you know, left and right, because
it's good. We need to call our own sides out, because there's a lot of
they're not
bullying and disingenuous behavior on both sides, for sure.
Absolutely. They're not following scripture. They don't even know scripture, you know, and they're prideful. It's like it's competition to them. You know, they feel like they need to go over there. So they would be on Oz's page or, you know, Murder Shed Steve or all these different people that's over at Tart, like hammering them on their posts where they just wanted to express themselves. So I'm on there like, why are you here? You know, how are you helping? Yeah. What compelled you to just come comment on their stuff where they wanted, you know? So that's my thing. I don't eat my own kind, because I value all people. And I always approach them, like if the fundamentalists or something like that, if they say something out of line, they're out of place, this, that, or the other, I approach them the first time with love. I'm very nice about it and everything else. And then as they almost always do, they will progress it to a point where, I just tell them, shut the hell up, go away. You're an asshole.
Yeah.
You're not here to spread gospel. You're just prideful. That's it. You're an idiot. Go away. And I think a lot more Christians need to be like that. We need to stamp out those who feel the need to go out there and tell the LGBT people, you're sinning, you're doing this, you're doing that, you're living in sin. I can't support that. According to what sin is in the Bible, nobody lives without sin. So how can you go and say that they're sinning like you have a perfect life or something like that, so that pisses me off more than anything. That's
and in respect to the point that you were making, I was listening to your podcast the other day, and I remember hearing you say that you were talking about those preachers who are, you're going to go to hell, they hate LGBT people. And you said something to the effect of, those guys are atheist making machines. And I thought about that, and I thought, the same way, if someone who's an atheist or just any secular activist is arguing with a Christian and they conduct themselves rudely and they cuss them out and they make ad hominems, it's like, you're not making it the case that more people are going to understand your side and agree with you. If anything, you're just making your side look bad to the other people who hold it, who might have something better to offer.
If they were starting to be skeptical or something of that nature, and maybe coming out of this fundamentalist mindset, because that's the most dangerous ones. And, they've been fed their whole life that atheists can't be moral and this, that, and the other. And then you come and feed that narrative, then they're almost never going to come out of that. They're never going to go through a deconstruction. They're never going to, get out of that mindset, because you're confirming the same BS that they've been taught. So I agree 100% with that. That's, it's like, I don't think that, Christians are even supposed to go out and do as much public stuff as, a lot of the fundamentalists do. I think, honestly, we're supposed to just live a life as virtuous as possible and be an example and love people and, help the poor and the sick and do all these things. And if somebody asks you, just like Paul said, be ready to give a response. We're not supposed to go out there and tell people and preach in the streets and say, you're going to hell. You're going to hell. That's a North American thing that it's never been done like that. It was, the Puritans and the, I
don't know about never, but okay.
Well, no, seriously, that is something that started in the 19th century. That's part of the literal principle of Darby Nelson, that he's the one that actually started that whole literal principle thing in Europe. And it was early 19th. And then the Moody Bible and the Scofield Bible were released in the US, which propagated his type of literal principle. Because if you look at, the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, all of these ancient churches, they all allowed for, the science. They allowed for evolution. They allowed for all these different adventures.
A lot of denominations of Christianity didn't exactly allow for other denominations of Christianity, though, right? Like, we've had plenty of holy wars. Exactly. Okay.
That's why I reject church dogma. That's why, because even though I do hold to a more orthodox understanding of scripture and approach and all of that, I totally reject, the eternal torment, because it's not biblical. That's a dogma. And that's a dogma.
There's something I have to add to that really quickly about that. 1 second. Let me get this.
Uh-oh.
All right. Well, I feel sometimes you just got to get up and grab a book that's on the other side of the room. But I recently got this book. It's called The Apocalypse of... it's not showing very well. The Apocalypse of Peter. And there's a lot of disagreement within the Christian community over this, but it's said that this is where the first concept of the Christian, like the biblical hell, came from. It was removed from the Bible in around 100 AD. But I think that I was reading this, And I was like, finally, I get to see what hell's like. And I'm reading it, and it's like, yeah, it's not eternal. I'm like, hold on, my whole life has been a lie. And then I watched some YouTube videos where people talked about the Bible, and they were like, yeah, it doesn't say that hell is eternal. And I'm like, okay. So the first premise of my life as a Catholic was just a lie. Fun.
I spilled my bourbon. That's alcohol abuse. Yeah, no, I agree completely. I just bought into the whole eternal punishment thing too myself. And when I started studying it, there's very little biblical support for it. It is literally a dogma that crept into the church, and they just kind of adopted it.
It's been about a week since I've learned that hell wasn't actually supposed to be eternal.
No,
like 1 week for me. So
kicking and screaming, I moved to annihilationism because it's far more scriptural. It's, Jesus himself said, why fear man who can harm the body when you should fear God because he can harm the body and the soul. So what does that mean? If he can destroy the soul, you're telling me that he's keeping the soul alive for eternity to be in.
It doesn't really make sense.
No, it doesn't. And I'm trying so hard to be a universalist. I just haven't found a good argument. I am a partial universalist, and I'm a hopeful universalist. I hope universalism's true. I'm a partial universalist, and I don't believe that a litmus test of beliefs is what's going to save people. It's okay, because that's your works. If we're saved by grace, through faith is just trust. It's activity. It's all these different things. So if you're saved through grace, then how can belief come into that? How can you tell me that an all good God is going to condemn a Hindu who grew up in India and all they know is Hinduism? That's ignorant. It makes no sense, no logical sense, and I wouldn't worship a God like that.
So if I'm not mistaken, it sounds like in terms of like meta ethics, you don't sound like someone who subscribes to divine command theory one bit. You sound more like a natural law theorist. Is that a fair?
I would lean more to probably Aquinas's natural law.
Okay, because I wrote some notes about both of those types of meta ethics before this, because I wanted to like refresh my memory a bit, and guess the best way to like explain it for those who aren't familiar with natural law theory, because I know that you and I are, but some people listening might not be. Basically, Thomas Aquinas argued that God created the world according to natural laws, predictable, good-driven systems whereby life is sustained and everything can function. And as part of this natural order, God made certain things that were good for his creatures. So I feel like it's the way that sunlight and water are good for plants, the basic goods are what's good for us. And these, the way that plants seek sunlight and water, we seek these goods. And these goods were life, reproduction, to educate our offspring, to seek God, live in society, avoid offense, and shun ignorance. And he felt that we were just built with a survivor instinct, and that this survivor instinct would include morality. So in summary, it's just that Aquinas believed that God sort of gave us an instinctual morality himself naturally.
And that's why I say that, I usually approach ethics from like if I'm talking with atheists or agnostics, because I can absolutely get on board with, because I think it is, it is something that is derivative, of nature. Yeah. Let me get a basic meta-ethical kind of thing. For example, murder's wrong, but we disagree on what exactly murder is. If we were a tribe that, ate people, we wouldn't think that those people were people, and it's not wrong. But if we ate one of our own, that's murder. So we all kind of have this sense of, certain things are truly wrong. So I can totally get with, naturalistic explanations and things of that nature. I'm not totally off. I just think that when we take it to the next level, when we start talking about ontology and why, we all have this kind of central understanding of basically what's right and what's wrong. I just, I like to try to have as robust, fulfilled idea as possible. And that's really just what it boils down to is, when we talk about ontology or metaphysics, it's, none of it's demonstratable. It's kind of like an explanation, it's like inference to the best explanation. We have this, in my view, we have this God hypothesis that can answer so many different metaphysical questions.
Well, the laws of physics can be demonstrated.
Well, yes, but I'm not talking specifically about I'm talking like the metaphysical things, the abstract things, like mathematics. We can show that if you put two things together, you have two objects. But why is math true? Why can you and I both take, regardless of what number system we use, and come out to the same conclusion on these things? It's a lot of people just call them normative things, so
right. But we wouldn't say like math isn't demonstrable. Like we would provide, like you just gave an example of like what would be a demonstration of math. And then like when you can get to like why it's true is, like you said earlier, like getting away from the ontology and the epistemology of it.
Yeah, I don't think it's as demonstrable as most people think it is, because that's why we work under axioms. We have to assume certain things when we're doing logic, mathematics, and things like that. So
right, no matter what you do, there are always some number of assumptions.
So I'm just trying to, I'm trying to get an explanation of the axioms. That's the difference. It's
so this is like my take on axioms. So are you familiar? Obviously, you must be familiar with René Descartes, but have you heard of his? Descartes, one of my favorite philosophers. Have you heard of his analogy of I guess a brain full of ideas being sort of like a basket of apples, where like ideas are like bad apples, where like one bad apple can spoil the rest of the basket. So too can a bad idea spoil the other ideas within a mind. Right. So his strategy was to upend his basket of ideas, and the same way you would with apples, you would upend the basket, and the best thing you do is examine every apple and make sure that it's fine before you put it back in the basket. That he did this with his ideas, and I would say specifically, let's do this with our axioms, our presuppositions, where we examine them and see if we need them or not. And then if we need them, if we see that they're necessary and seem true, then we should put them back in our idea basket. And for me, logic and reason remain in that basket. Reality being real remains in that basket. Words having some meaning remain in that basket. But when it comes to like this God, I just see this unnecessary integer being added into an equation. And that's my understanding of it. Is I go, okay, like, sure, you could say that it, like, your intuition might tell you that there's a God. Your intuition would also tell you that the earth is flat. And, once you get a better understanding of the word, and as a skeptic, I mean, not to say that you're subscribing to skepticism per se, but like when you re-examine your ideas, which is something that you're doing, I would encourage you to, keep doing that, apply that criticism to your ideas about God being necessary for what it is you seem to think he's necessary for. But I wanted to ask you earlier, when you were talking about your religious studies, figuring out what's true or not true. Would you agree with me on this? Whether a God exists or doesn't exist, because neither of us claim absolute certainty, and I'm glad we agree on that. If it is not true that a God exists, do you want to lose your belief that a God exists?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that.
Well,
there are some Christians who will straight up, like, if you say, like, if God doesn't exist, do you want to know that? And they just go, he exists.
Yeah.
It's like, the fact that you could address my question honestly makes me feel like you're more confident in your belief.
It's also a two-part thing. There is a pragmatic approach to, a God belief. The hope for something more, the hope for life after. And regardless of what a lot of skeptics will say, that is actually a good thing. Most psychologists would agree that, if something is pragmatic in the life of people or certain people, and they make the value of life better for them or things like that, and it's not harming other people, that's the key. If it's not harming other people, then that's something that, people should be allowed to express, pursue, this, that, and the other. Now, with that said, I look at God as more of, an explanation for the unexplainable. And I don't mean that like a God of the gaps. I mean the thing that science can't explain. The metaphysical things. That's, God makes sense in that. Also,
so I know that you think that you're reasoning differently, but you did just say that God is something that you inject for an explanation for what science can't understand, and like that is the God of the gaps argument.
No, well, actually, God of the gaps is not even really a fallacy. That God of the gaps is something.
Well, an argument from ignorance is a fallacy, and the God of the gaps.
Argument from ignorance is a fallacy. God of the gaps is actually something that was coined by theists, and it was because of certain Christians wanting to interject God as an explanation in a scientific endeavor. Now, if you say that we don't know why the sun comes up, therefore God did it, then you are positing a God of the gaps. But if we find out that there's a scientific explanation and you hold on to it, but there's no certainty there or something like that, and you still hold on to that, then you're committing the fallacy of God of the gaps. I'm talking about questions that can't be answered by science, metaphysical questions. By definition, it's not a scientific endeavor. So
you're using there not being an answer. How would that get you to God without an argument from ignorance?
Oh, it's easy. It's induction. It's inference. I mean, we make inferences all the time,
Right, but when the things that you're making inferences about are things that you don't know or things that haven't been answered yet by science, like I understand that you're trying to avoid committing the God of the gaps fallacy, but or the God of the gaps and argument from ignorance fallacy. But in my perspective, it seems like you're saying, hey, I'm not committing the argument from ignorance, but here are some things that science doesn't know. And since science doesn't know some of these things, I'm more justified in believing in God. I don't see that.
First, let me clarify. That's not an argument from ignorance at all. An argument from ignorance is when we say that we don't know about something like in history, or kind of like the argument of silence. We don't know this aspect of it, so we're positing this as an answer. Just like if we look at the argument from silence in history that they don't mention this, therefore it's evidence, that it didn't happen. Those are both fallacies. So,
but how are you not? So, what's the difference in what you're doing?
That's exactly right. So, what does science do? What does it study?
Science studies the natural world.
Okay. So, if science studies the natural world, do you think that if there was a God, we would find it through science?
No. Because if God exists supernaturally, then the study of the natural world probably wouldn't be how we would find that.
Okay. Do you think through science we could find the ontological grounding of things?
Yes.
How?
I mean, the grounding of things, like the Big Bang, for example. Like how are we able?
No. So let's say that, just for argument, we say that logic is this prescriptive part of nature. I know some people argue it's descriptive, but let's say it's this prescriptive part of nature. Okay, we have to use logic in order to ration. Well, how do we account for the fact that that is prescriptive in our reasoning when we have to assume reasoning to do science? So how could science find the source of what logic is? It's not a concrete entity.
So again, so like we have to be circular in our reasoning, just about concluding that like logic and reason work, and logic and reason would be what we would use to apply to observations that we made, and this would bring us to science. So as far as like how do we find the grounding for something, it is your criticism sort of based on like us using science to prove science?
It's the things we have to assume for science in order for science to work. How do we account
right
for
but I'm saying that God's not one of them, and like we assume logic and reason work. We have a reason to
so you hold on a second. You made a positive proposition, a claim. Why would you say that God is not the source of those things we have to assume in order to do science? What evidence
because
is there
you
not?
Well, no, because if you and I are talking about things that exist in the natural world, and we agree that like our concept of God that we're referring to is a supernatural one, then we would say that, okay, if God's the supernatural and we're talking about things pertaining to the natural world, then we would say it's not God, because God would fit that category of supernatural. That's why. So I what I'm saying is like I don't see any reason to arrive at a God. So like, yeah, I have to use my assumption that logic and reason work to apply them to science, but I think that we ought to presuppose or assume as few things as possible. And would you agree with me on that point? So I think the disagreement is whether or not.
I agree with Occam's razor. I mean, we should propose as few explanations as possible. Few entities or causes as possible.
Right. Just not add unnecessary like entities into the equation. And from my perspective, when we reason out about the world that we live in, God seems to be this completely unnecessary integer that's just being added into the equation. And the fact that if you were to talk to me about ethics or something, you would do so without relying on your God, I think kind of shows that like we can do this without going to God. So like, why go to God for it when we can just do it?
Right. We can do it with only half the story and no grounding for what we do. So let me explain a little more. So you agree that, mathematics, logic, and these things are axiomatic, right? We have to, we start with these axioms before we can, what is an axiom?
An axiom is something that is self-evidently true.
Right. So it would be the name of my podcast, A Brute Fact. It's a brute fact that, that, and for the people that don't get it, being brute facts is usually used by naturalists, and I'm a Christian, and I thought it'd be funny to have a Christian with a brute fact kind of thing. Anyway, so in brute facts is another way of saying we can't account for its existence. It just exists. Okay. That, while not technically begging the question, is like skirting very close to it exists because it just exists. That's not the argument being made, but it's very close to, and
so I was going to say that actually axioms kind of do beg the question. I think an axiom is an example of where we have to beg the question, and we acknowledge that begging the question is a fallacy, and that's why we're able to say that our senses aren't entirely perfect.
And that's why you just answered my question. That's why I think that there's a higher something, because I don't think we ever have to beg the question. I don't think we ever have to use fallacious reasoning. When there is a source and explanation, when there's a source and explanation for those axioms that people are just calling axioms, that's where the explanatory scope comes in. So if we can explain, that's what ontology is. It's a study of being. If we can explain all of these axioms with the simplest answer possible, then that's how you come up with what we call a God. I mean, you can call it could be, if I wasn't a Christian, I'd still be a deist or a pantheist or something like that, because there just seems to be too many axioms. Damn that mic. There just seems to be too many axioms or too many unanswered It just is that way, and I'm just not happy with
Right.
it. It's not a
So
knock on you, and it doesn't mean I'm better than you or anything else. I'm just not happy
Right.
with the answer, you know.
So right, but so you can be unhappy with the answers, but when we're looking at truth, and we like talked about earlier, sort of upending our idea basket and only re-entering ideas that we see as being necessary, I would agree with you that at least for most people, God seems to be axiomatic, the same way Earth being flat seems to be axiomatic. But again, as we get older and we learn more about the world that we live in, I think we should question these axioms as much as we can, see if we need them or not. With the God, I'm understanding that what you're saying is your reason for God is you think that God is a necessary axiom.
Well,
But what I'm saying is,
I wouldn't say axiom. I wouldn't say axiom.
weren't you saying that God was self-evidently true?
No.
No? Okay.
No.
I misunderstood.
Yeah, no. So the most convincing arguments for a God for me would be first and foremost, you know, the contingency argument. The second would be fine tuning. The third would be something like the Kalam. I'm not a huge fan of the Kalam, but it's more of why there's something instead of stay there. Why there's something rather than nothing. You know, why?
Right. Well, in respect to those arguments, a discussion about each one of them is certainly has enough conversation within it for its own podcast.
Right.
So
but I just want to throw this out there real quick. So when you're talking about an axiom, I don't think it's an axiom. I think that the contingency first, because I think that there is, given the contingency argument, there is a necessary foundation to reality. And that necessary foundation to reality would be the perfect entity for all of these axioms that we have. So it's not an axiom, it's an explanatory scope thing. You know, it's kind of like an inference from reality is how I would explain, you know, why I hold to, you know, something other than. I don't like to say God because people have their own ideas of what God is. You know, I like to say something other, some intelligent, powerful something.
Okay. So in summary of this sort of second conversation that we've added, and I'm glad that we've had this as well as the morality discussion, I think that our disagreement is going to lie in whether or not you're committing an argument from ignorance in regard to what science doesn't know, and why you think that somehow, with other premises that I'm not mentioning for the sake of steelmanning, I'll mention, you know, more premises involved, that you think you're arriving at a God. I think you're still using areas where you lack knowledge to make the argument, and I think that it's still suiting the definition of an argument from ignorance. And
not to keep going, you know, just on this road, because I know you probably want to go somewhere with it. I would say real quick, it's not an argument from ignorance unless you're accusing, you know, great philosophers throughout time making such an elementary mistake in philosophy. So
they do.
No,
I'm reading Aristotle right now, and
I don't think I would okay, we'll just leave that disagreement. I don't think that men that bright and that educated make such an elementary mistake. The second thing would be
corpuscularian theory.
Yeah, it's possible. Yeah, absolutely. So
okay.
So with that, I would say that also saying that there's knowledge itself is a massive subject. That is something that is very hotly contested to this very day in epistemology. What knowledge is, how can we have it? There's lots of different theories of knowledge. So, you know, I'd be careful about, you know, charging people with what you don't know and things like that because of the different ideas of knowledge. There's not a one size fits everybody thing.
I think I'm going to I'll leave a link in the comments to this video, and I'll send you a link as well. There's a lecture given by an Oxford professor named Peter Millikan, who talks about knowledge and skepticism, how we know what we know, different definitions of the word knowledge. And I just found this to be It's like a 50 to 60-minute lecture. It's not that long. But if you understand, if you watch this lecture, you'll have a better understanding of the, like you were saying, multiple different meanings of the word knowledge. Some people, and you've heard of these apologists that are called precepts, right? And you're not an apologist. So,
no, yeah. If you and I have a common bane of existence, I love you, Reformed brothers. I do. But the question begging, dishonest tactics of presupposition. I started in presup, okay, and I kind of fell into it. I didn't seek it out, and when I
think you and I are going to have a good friendship.
Pastor Mike and I talked about having a call-in show, hoping that we got presups because he would have, an atheist and a Christian both talking to presups. I loathe it. Absolutely loathe it. It's dishonest because, to say that you're borrowing from my worldview, let's just use, because they're showing they don't want to advance the conversation, because we can all agree that we have to start with logic and reason. We can all agree. Yes. It doesn't matter where it comes from. Let's start there and move the conversation along. We don't have to stop there and say, well, how do you justify that? Well, how do you justify that? How do you justify being alive?
By what standard?
I exist. God.
Yeah.
God. And I can't do it, bro. But
anyway,
real quick to your science thing. Be very careful, because you're skirting on the edges of philosophical naturalism, which is question begging. Because I like that you said that we can't find God through science if he's supernatural, because a lot of people, a lot of skeptics don't realize it, but they hold to, we use methodological naturalism when we're doing science, and we should be positing outside entities and all these different things. We should go as far as we can. Philosophical naturalism, which I'm sure you're aware of, is when you say that the natural is all that exists, and if we knew God existed, we'd find it through science. Therefore, the natural is all that exists. It's question begging. It's circular, and
I don't think it's fallacious, but I don't think the fallacy in mind is question begging. I think the fallacy in mind is something more akin to the black swan fallacy. Have you heard of the black swan?
Yeah, but it is question begging, because you're assuming from the get-go that the natural is all that exists, and then you're going through the method to prove that the natural is all that exists. That's textbook question begging.
Right. Well, okay, so I don't think that you're straw manning, because straw manning is certainly like a deliberate sort of misrepresentation. And maybe what you just said actually does accurately describe many people. But as somebody who identifies as a methodological naturalist, and if somebody asks me, right, but I actually say, like, philosophically speaking, I would call myself a methodological naturalist. I think that methodological naturalism is what I apply to my knowledge, and you're right that you wouldn't use the study of the natural world to arrive at whether or not something supernatural existed. However, then you're left without a reason to, I think, as far as evidence-based reasons. If science is what you do for like evidence-based things, because a lot of people go, well, what evidence would you accept for a God? And the honest answer that I could give you is I'm not entirely sure, just that something omnipotent would know. And if something omnipotent wanted me to know, that it follows from that it would let me know.
I think this is a real important point too. So do you think that science is the only way we can know things?
No. And before I get forward, I do want to say, because it seemed like you mentioned earlier, but I'm not concluding that a God does not exist. I lie in the field of, I am not convinced that a God exists.
Yeah, and I'd also say, I mean, kudos to you that you're not a method. I mean, you're not a philosophical naturalist. So, in the fact that you answered that, we couldn't find God through science because he is supernatural, and there's nothing wrong with being a methodological naturalist. Absolutely, I'm a science guy. I mean, I'm all for methodological naturalism. However,
for me, methodological naturalism works as a worldview itself. And I know that that's not the consistent usage of it throughout most people. So I realized that, like, I'm kind of biting the bullet on that one. Maybe I should just stick with the word materialism. But I wouldn't say.
I'm not. Yeah, I don't want to
It's
go.
not question begging because it's like you're not saying. I mean, I guess, yeah, it's question begging if somebody concludes that there isn't a God. But if somebody says, we use methodological naturalism to learn things, okay, that gives us reasons to believe in things within the natural world. I see reasons to believe in things in the natural world. I don't see reasons to believe in the supernatural.
I think it's worthy of a show itself. Maybe you can come on my show and then we'll talk about that part of it.
We'll have to do it.
I think we've gone so far past morality that.
Well, yes, I feel like we got away from it, but you know what? It's been a great discussion nonetheless.
Absolutely. That's the cool thing is we, both of us are able to, kind of, set our presuppositions aside and try to understand each other. So it's been, I think it's been fantastic. I knew it'd be a good show with you anyways. I reached out to you and told you I'd seen some of your stuff on there, and to see somebody else who, nothing against those who aren't into philosophy, but to see, some other people who are really into philosophy and things of that nature. I'm totally happy with, having discussion and everything. And I'm right about everything. I do, introspection all the time. So my conversations are genuine. I've changed my position a million times and I am totally open to it. So
that's good, man. I hope you stay that way. Yeah, definitely. I appreciate you coming on, man. It's been a great discussion. I guess I would leave the viewers with just a note of how discussions can be held. It wasn't a debate, obviously, but I feel like even if people are doing debates, if they would carry the dialogue aspect, the open discussion aspect out a little bit more like they did today, and not just like get angry and cuss people out like some atheists do. Plenty of them do. Some come to mind more than others, but let's be respectful to one another because we only hurt ourselves when we're rude to people, right?
Well, and in the end, we're all trying to figure out this thing called life.
Life and truth. And even though
reality, we all have different experiences, we all have different understandings, and all of these things, in the end is, people like to put that wall up and be defensive. We gotta put the wall down and try to have a little empathy, understand the other person. Let's be honest in our conversations, not trying to convert people or deconvert people. Let's talk about those things that we all struggle with, so
because there are definitely a lot of problems that exist whether you hold a worldview or not, and I think that it's good for people to see and especially find other people out there just in the YouTube community that you can make friends with people who hold completely different worldviews and come to a place where you would be there for each other. If I don't think you know me well enough that I'd be the person you wanted to talk to, but if someone close to you died and you needed someone to talk to, I would be there for you as much as I could be. And I think you would do the same for me. Absolutely. And it just goes forward. Let's build a community of YouTubers, and not just YouTubers, but let's build a community of thinkers. And when we disagree with each other, let's be civil about figuring out why and try to break down why the disagreements are where they are.
And I'd like to add one thing before you close out on it. That's a very good point about if something tragic happens. I'm kind of an advocate for mental health. We have got to, if you're hurting, if you're in pain, if you have this dark cloud that doesn't go away, I'm telling you, I suffered from severe depression younger in my life and an anxiety disorder. And if you can't tell by how much I move around, I'm ADD as hell. So, I didn't know I had that kind of suck it up, be a man kind of thing. I couldn't talk to people, things of that nature. That stuff's got to go. If you're hurting, if you have this dark cloud, if you can't find, some kind of joy in life or something like that, I'm telling you, it's going to get worse. You have got to seek somebody out. And I'm on Facebook at Eddie Crume. I'm on YouTube. at Brute Facts. I don't care where you go. I'm on TikTok. Right now is Not a Real Christian. I'm probably going to change that because I get a lot of times, you're not a real Christian. You don't know scripture. So, things like that. So I'm
Really?
willing to talk to. Oh yeah.
So, you're not a real Christian. No, you're not a real Christian.
That's exactly. No
true Christian. Yeah.
Yeah. So I will talk to anybody at any time. If you need somebody, a stranger to talk to, my ears are open. My mouth is sealed. Anybody you have to see, you got to see somebody. You got to talk to somebody. Don't let that stuff go.
That's great, man. I hope that anybody listening, listened. And if you're somebody who's maybe a Christian listening and maybe a skeptic, might not be the easiest person to talk to about these problems. Maybe Eddie would be easier to talk to. You just heard him give a few places where you could find him. Eddie, thank you so much for doing that. I'm going to close out. I was going to have some outro music, but I'm still figuring out StreamYard. So you're all left without any music. Sorry. If
you saw my last show, you'll see I had trouble getting my outro going too. So
yeah. Oh, and apologies to anyone if there was an awkward second or half second before the intro started. I'm a StreamYard amateur, but fuck it. I make the stream better by admitting it to myself and my viewers, right?
I appreciate you.
All right, Eddie. Well,
thanks, bud.
Be safe, man. Take it easy.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, late.